These days, it's starting to feel like every other game announcement is for a re-release or a remaster of some earlier game. Which needn't necessarily be a bad thing. This remaster of Mafia is a great idea. Bring the story to a new generation of gamers, while fixing all the janky gameplay mechanics and disappointing polygon count of the original. But others, like the infamous remastered GTA series, are... There's a reason my footage is from the original games. Retro gamers of a more acerbic and combative bent may point at this tendency to re-release the same game over and over as evidence of an industry that is either insufficiently creative or too risk-averse to do anything but the same old thing over and over again, often without much effort to justify buying a full-price game. Unless they played a lot of point-and-click adventures on the PC, in which case this remastered world would be all too familiar. The point-and-click adventure is on a resurgence of late, with well-regarded remasters of classic LucasArts games from Double Fine, and Ron Gilbert returning to make brand new classic adventures, with Thimbleweed Park a success, and a new Monkey Island just around the corner. Or should I perhaps say, graphical adventure, because for most of its life there was no pointing, and no clicking, thanks to the computer mouse being far from ubiquitous. In fact, the LucasArts adventure ended its life issuing the mouse once more, in favour of keyboard-based tank controls. The official starting point of the graphical adventure is in 1980, with Roberta and Ken Williams' Mystery House. But I would contend this is not so much a graphical adventure as an adventure with graphics. The real beginning of the graphical adventure, where the gameplay is unsunderably entwined with the on-screen representation of the game world, dates from 1984, and perhaps the most famous series from Ken and Roberta's company, Sierra Online. This is, of course, King's Quest, the first adventure to use graphics for more than just illustrations on a game which otherwise still played like a standard text adventure. In King's Quest, you wandered around. You saw things on screen you might want to interact with. You probably fell in the river a lot, and drowned a lot, before realising you could type swim. This may seem quite advanced for the PC in 1984, given the number of times I've shown you games from as late as 1987, which still only used the pink and cyan 4-colour CGA palette. But that's because from the start, adventures were designed to show off the PC's graphical capabilities. King's Quest was built because IBM wanted a range of launch software to show off the capabilities of the Model 4860 PCjr. The PCjr was a strange old thing, a cut-down, cost-reduced PC for the home, that nevertheless featured graphic and sound capabilities far ahead of what any proper PC was capable of, until the release of the enhanced graphics adapter later in 1984. But while the 16-colour graphics may have looked impressive on the surface, it was all part of the cost-cutting. The PCjr's graphics adapter shared the limited system memory, meaning despite sharing the same CPU, it was slower than a PC, due to needing to wait its turn to access that shared memory. Still, King's Quest would only need to redraw the screen when the player moved between rooms, so it could look genuinely impressive, compared to what you saw on the 8-bit home computers of the time. Impressive enough that IBM stumped up a large part of the development costs, rescuing Sierra from a disastrous foray into console games, just in time for the US video game crash. Despite this, it was a mere 21 days from the release of the PCjr version to Sierra publishing one for regular PCs. IBM fearing anti-monopoly legislation so much, it demanded the publishing contract for King's Quest not be exclusive. Sierra would have to solve some interesting technical problems to fit King's Quest into the 128K memory of the PCjr, and ship it on a single 360KB floppy disk. One of the early problems wasn't so much fitting it on the computer, as fitting it in developers' heads. With so many rooms, objects, and different things for a player to do, programming all the logic in assembly language would have been a nightmare. So instead, Sierra created a game engine. Rather than hard code the game logic, they would build a platform to interpret scripts, detailing what the player could and couldn't do on each screen, and which animations to play in response. That way, the game logic could be implemented in a high-level, easy-to-understand scripting language, while the animation and drawing code would still be written in assembler to keep it suitably fast and light on memory. This was a trick Sierra had employed ever since Mystery House, where Ken had built an interpreter so Roberta, a less experienced programmer, could still enter room descriptions and items. Speaking of memory, King's Quest would have a large number of unique screens, over 80 in the final game. Even running at a resolution of 160 by 200, with 4 bits per pixel, that meant each screen would be a 16 kilobyte bitmap. Remember, this is long before PCs were powerful enough to save and load images with PNG compression. So instead of storing the finished images, Sierra instead stored the commands to create them: lines, pen colour changes, and flood fills. This was a solution they'd been using ever since Mystery House, which had to fit inside the 110K capacity of an early Apple II disc. For the simple screens of Mystery House, this required far less storage space, and even for King's Quest, this vector art style saved a lot of space over bitmaps, at the expense of taking longer to draw. And since drawing only happened when a player moved between screens, this was an acceptable trade-off, and it meant the average King's Quest screen took only 1 to 2 kilobytes to represent. Early versions didn't use a back buffer, meaning you saw the screen being painted instruction by instruction. But this was changed when Sierra realised it gave away some puzzle solutions. And sadly, despite being technically vector graphics, the positions are not subpixel accurate. So you can't upscale these games without some manual tweaking. Yes, games plural, in a big way. The original King's Quest engine grew into something called AGI, the Adventure Game Interpreter. AGI let you create a game without needing too much in the way of technical expertise. Draw some locations, create some inventory objects, and write a few simple scripts to turn those into a game. And wow, did Sierra ever capitalise on that? In the few years following King's Quest, if you could name a concept, there was probably an AGI adventure based on it. Space Quest, Police Quest, Gold Rush, The Black Cauldron, Mixed Up Mother Goose, Manhunter. Sierra even tried branching out into adult games with Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards. Except Larry is in fact a remastered and expanded edition of an earlier game. And I'm not talking about the crowd-funded reloaded version from the 2010s. The original 1987 AGI version is itself a remake. Way back in 1981, in the early days, before Ken Williams' consulting business Online Systems became Sierra Online, due to another company existing with the same name, they had published a text adventure for the Apple II, called Soft Porn Adventure. This was programmed by Chuck Benton, and featured some controversy-baiting box art, with naked Sierra employees in a hot tub, including Roberta Williams herself. Soft porn was a big success for Online Systems. Not only did the inevitable complaints from moral guardians gain it a lot of free publicity, but in the classic style of people buying porn everywhere, game stores didn't just order soft porn. They ordered the whole Online Systems catalogue, in the hope of being able to nonchalantly say, "I don't know how that got in there," if any respectable member of society happened to spot their copy of soft porn. There is, by the way, nothing pornographic about soft porn other than the title and the box art. In 1986, Sierra employee Al Lowe, who had been working on their Disney properties until they lost the license, suggested remaking soft porn. Or perhaps it was Ken Williams' younger brother John, also employed by Sierra. Exactly who is lost to history, but whoever made the original suggestion, it was Al Lowe who suggested making a parody of soft porn. Because, in his words, it was so dated it may as well be wearing a leisure suit. And he probably said leisure suit, being American. Regardless of accents, those 80s references. Of course, these days, leisure/leisure suit Larry is itself so dated and of its time, it may as well be sporting a mullet, including some rather teeth-clenching moments with attitudes that have definitely moved on since the 1980s. But on release in 1987, it was hugely popular, and the decision to lampoon the title character as hopelessly stuck in the 70s went down well. The humour did generally stop short of outright misogyny. And despite being 3 years old by this point, even AGI didn't look too dated. The pixels might have been chunky, but many PC games were still releasing as CGA only, and those few sporting a 320x200 EGA mode didn't always make the best use of it. That was about to change, thanks to a little games company further up the coast in Marin County, California. In the late 1970s, George Lucas, someone who would become no stranger to the cheeky remaster, was flush with Star Wars money and keen to establish a foothold in other forms of entertainment. As part of this, he set up two computer divisions, the Games Group and the Graphics Group. Early on, the Games Group published action games for the Commodore 64, hiring programmers including Gary Winnick and Ron Gilbert. The Graphics Group created tools for computer rendering and eventually became Pixar. That's a different story. In 1985, Winnick and Gilbert were given the task of creating an original game. The two shared a similar sense of humour and a love of B-movies, and decided to create a game lampooning the plot of classic 1960s sci-fi horror. Upon seeing Sierra's King's Quest while on holiday, Gilbert realised the adventure game was the perfect genre for their B-movie horror game, Maniac Mansion. While drawing inspiration from them, the Lucasfilm Games team also wanted to fix what they saw as two major flaws in the Sierra graphic adventures. Firstly, while the game was graphical, you still interacted with it like a text adventure, typing in commands using a prompt. It wasn't always obvious what you could ask the character to do, or what they could interact with in any given situation. Secondly, Sierra's games infamously punished you for using normal everyday logic. If you picked up the wrong thing, or walked in the wrong direction, you'd get an instant game over. Worse, some game over situations weren't instant. You could play the whole game, only to find at the end you were missing a critical item from the very first screen. They also ran into the same problem Sierra had while programming King's Quest. Implementing the logic for an adventure game in assembly language was just too much hard work. So they created their own engine for building adventure games, the script creation utility for Maniac Mansion, or SCUM for short. Although initially targeted at the C64, as with Lucasfilm's previous games, the early SCUM games also got ported to the PC. Graphically, these didn't move the game on much from AGI. Unlike Sierra's vector-based approach, the early SCUM games show their C64 heritage by using what appears to be tile maps. Generally quite well, although there's the occasional obvious repeated pattern, and it's clear everything lines up on a grid. But control-wise, they may as well have been from another planet. The point-and-click approach made the adventure game so much more accessible. No longer did you need to guess verbs and the names of objects, and you could move the mouse around the screen and find out what was available to click on. Back down in Coarsegold, Sierra hadn't been sleeping. In 1988, they released King's Quest IV, debuting the new Sierra Creative Interpreter, or SCI. This kept the vector backgrounds, but bumped resolution up to 320x200. Trust me, it looked high-res back in the day. It also added support for the AdLib sound card, and Roland MT32. In 1988, Sierra also released King's Quest IV, using their tried and tested AGI interpreter. You may be excused a quick WTF here. Yes, they released the game, and its remastered edition, at the same time. Or possibly the game and its retro demake, depending which way round you look at it. But Sierra's idea was a rational one. Release the fancy SCI version, so buyers with newer, more powerful PCs could enjoy improved graphics and sound, while users stuck on older 8088-based PCs with limited memory could still play through the same story in a less demanding AGI-based edition. Not that it worked out. The AGI version didn't sell well, and while Sierra would continue to offer alternative versions of their adventures for lower-spec computers well into the 1990s, they all ran on the same SCI interpreter. One conclusion you may draw from this is Sierra were keen to sweat the absolute maximum possible number of sales out of their games. King's Quest had already been re-released multiple times, first in 1986, with a minor upgrade to AGI version 2, then again in 1987, this time with the subtitle Quest for the Crown, and a 3.5-inch floppy disk version, available for the first time. Which led them to an idea. Given the story and the game design already existed, why not assign somebody to make the AGI games over again in SCI and sell them all over again, as a definitive edition whose higher resolution graphics would match the latest King's Quests? Sierra gave Josh Mandel his first full game project, remaster and expand the original King's Quest into the SCI engine. The result is, by the standards of the time, a gorgeous game. By the time of its 1990 release, Sierra's artists had learned how to make the vector-based graphics system really sing, and with increasingly powerful computers, a greater storage space, each individual scene could feature a huge number of vector commands. Something Space Quest 3 showed off to excellent effect in its garbage freighter scenes. But it was also seen as a bit unnecessary. Maybe even a bit sacrilegious. King's Quest's blocky art had its own charm. The plot had been meddled with, making the SCI version neither a new game, nor a faithful upscaling of the original. It didn't sell well, and Sierra didn't try remastering any other King's Quest games. The team at Lucasfilm Games had also been upgrading their engine. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, released in 1989, used bitmap backgrounds. This was partly due to a growing acceptance of games coming on multiple discs, and even requiring hard drive installation, but also due to a clever trick used for storing graphics: run-length encoding. Run-length encoding meant that, rather than storing every single pixel individually, the file would instead store how many consecutive pixels of the same colour were next. So long runs of pixels could be stored in just a couple of bytes, one number for the length of the run, and one number for the palette index. As a bonus, this even made the images quicker and easier to draw on the PC, thanks to an instruction called rep_store_sb, which would copy the same value to a series of consecutive memory addresses very quickly. Naturally, having the image already encoded in value count pairs was perfect for feeding to this. EGA images were also perfect for this kind of compression, featuring large blocks of solid colour, which could be easily run-length encoded. You'll notice Indy's artwork uses a lot of these large flat areas of colour, and does so very effectively. Downside of run-length encoding is when it comes to dithering. One of the iconic features of early SCI games is their extensive use of dithering. Not the kind that involves failing to make a decision, although with the ever-present risk of death, you would be forgiven for dithering in a Sierra game. No, this type of dithering is a checkerboard pattern that alternates between two colours. When playing these games on a vintage monitor, the pixels would tend to blur together, So instead of that checkerboard pattern, you saw a new colour, in between the two colours making up the diver pattern. And SCI's vector-based approach to graphics made these very easy to do. The artist simply had to say, fill this area with a divored fill. But for run-length encoding, this is the worst possible scenario. Every pixel, the colour changes. The longest run is 1. For run-length encoding, you need to store two values. One to tell you what the length of the run is, then one for the colour. Well, some run-length encoded formats use tricks to get around that, so it's not quite that bad in reality. But even so, you're still not getting the same level of compression as you would get from those big solid fills from indie. Which is why developers at what was now LucasArts were horrified when Mark Ferrari showed them the game artwork for their latest adventure, Loom. Everything was divored. But thankfully the team worked out a way of efficiently encoding those runs of divored pixels. And so we have the version of Loom everyone fondly remembers. Or possibly not that version. See, Lucasfilm/Arts were keen to upgrade their games to keep them looking good as technology advanced. The first example of these were Maniac Mansion and Zak McKracken, which saw higher resolution EGA re-releases early in their life. Those re-releases became so ubiquitous, it's now quite hard to find the originals. But on top of this, Lucasfilm were keen on expanding to new markets, one of which was Japan. At the turn of the 1990s, Japan still had its own personal computer ecosystem, including the FM Towns, a Fujitsu computer series, which used x86 processors, but featured its own graphics and sound hardware, and, incredibly early for a home computer, a CD-ROM drive. Lucasfilm created a dedicated version of Zak McKracken for the FM Towns, featuring remastered 256 colour versions of all the graphics, and unique sounds. 21 years before Skyrim, and we have a remaster of a game that has already been remastered. Between the FM Towns, dedicated CD-ROM versions, and VGA re-releases, every adventure game after Maniac Mansion saw some kind of 256 colour upgrade. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Loom, and The First Secret of Monkey Island, the latter of which had multiple further releases, which eventually introduced the 9-verb control layout and graphical inventory of later LucasArts titles. But where King's Quest SCI was poorly received when new, but has been judged more kindly retrospectively, these games are the opposite. When new, they were seen as the definitive versions. But as the technical novelty of 256 colour VGA has worn off, the limitations of LucasArts' early VGA work has become rather apparent. Overuse of the gradient fill tool, plastic-looking surfaces, and the loss of strong and atmospheric stylistic choices from the original EGA versions have all weighed on these remasters in recent years. Loom creator Brian Moriarty says the definitive version of Loom is still the original EGA, not least because they cut out a third of his game to get the dialogue to fit on the CD-ROM for the PC VGA version. LucasArts' VGA art would only really come of age with the first games to be developed with VGA as the lead platform, Monkey Island 2 and Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. While offering lower colour modes for EGA cards and the Amiga and Atari, these were divored from the 256 colour originals. And if you were wondering why this was suddenly possible, when I talked earlier about the impossibility of doing bitmap graphics with details down to a single pixel, then the answer is simple. 11 discs, in the case of the Amiga version. Even on PC, with high-density floppies, there were still 6 discs in the box, and the 11 or 12 megabyte game installs for these adventures was tough going, in an era where 40 megabytes was a reasonable size for an entire hard disk. But we're getting away from remasters of things. Well, except both Monkey Islands received special edition versions in 2010, a year which is probably not that far off being considered retro gaming itself. Sierra would also embrace VGA, and its endless disks full of bitmaps, compared to LucasArts' fumbling early steps, with a little bit too much enthusiasm for the gradient tool. Sierra hit the mark first try. King's Quest V, released in 1990, is gorgeous. It's still SCI running the show underneath, but the old EGA vector graphics had been supplanted by 256 colour bitmaps, and that all-important point-and-click interface. Of course, Sierra kept their frustrating puzzle design, in which death would always be just around the corner, or, indeed, inescapable, thanks to a decision you made 3 hours ago. The Sierra philosophy was so infamous, LucasArts gave them sass for it in Monkey Island. Although Sierra sassed them right back for, in their view, having games that had no challenge, due to being impossible to lose. King's Quest V was followed by equally lush VGA versions for all of Sierra's major series: Space Quest IV, Police Quest 3, Leisure Suit Larry 5, and Quest for Glory 3. Space Quest IV also gained a talkie CD-ROM version, but Sierra's view was that only the best-selling games would receive CD voice versions, leading to the oddity that while Space Quest IV has a version with voice acting, Space Quest V does not. Strangely, they weren't quite so worried about the poor sales of the King's Quest I remake. SCI-1 saw VGA remakes of Quest for Glory, Space Quest I, Police Quest I, and what was by now a remake of a remake, Leisure Suit Larry 1. Lump in Leisure Suit Larry Reloaded and Soft Porn Adventure is a tale that's been told more times than the plot of some Disney live-action remakes. Whether it was the bigger graphical upgrade, or less attachment to the originals, these remakes did do a little better than the SCI version of King's Quest. But they were not without their controversy. Original Space Quest artist Mark Crow hated the goofy B-movie style chosen for the VGA remake. Space Quest was supposed to be set in a futuristic universe, not a cheesy 1950s retro one. But while not complete disasters, none of the VGA remakes sold well enough for Sierra to want to continue the idea, and the remastered SCI versions fizzled out after Police Quest I and Quest for Glory released in 1992, although they would occasionally turn up in later collections as the preferred version, albeit with the AGI originals, often hidden in the depths of the CD file system. Not that this stopped fans of the games from wanting to keep this up. In 2001, Brittany Brimhall and Christopher Warren formed Sierra Entertainment, with the intention of remaking the early King's Quest games in the same style as the later VGA SCI versions, using an engine that was almost indistinguishable from a late SCI game to the casual user. In fact, perhaps a little too indistinguishable, because early versions of the King's Quest I fan remake used art from other Sierra VGA games, which then owners Vivendi were a little less than happy about. Sierra, by that point renamed AGD Interactive, took the hint and replaced all of the background art with original versions, although Sir Graham remained suspiciously similar to his appearance in King's Quest V. It was the follow-up where AGD took off as game designers, though. King's Quest II, Romancing the Throne, had always been considered a bit of an oddity in the series. Some severe early installment weirdness, including an appearance of the Batmobile, a plot which wandered inexplicably between unrelated set pieces, and puzzle design that was Sierra at their most brutal. King's Quest II, Romancing the Stones, is rather different. No, not to the level of being a visual novel where you attempt to seduce Keith Richards, but changing and expanding the plot, giving characters new motivations and personalities, and making Kalima a bit less of a deserted wasteland. They did keep that mean-spirited bridge puzzle. This expanded game is all a happy coincidence. Nervous that Vivendi might continue their unhappiness at having their games copied, AGDI decided to change the story, to produce a more distinct game. Turns out, Vivendi only cared about ripped artwork. we got an interesting remake out of it. You may ask at this point whether there's a remake of the final AGI-only King's Quest, King's Quest III. Well, no. There are two. Both developed at around the same time. We have AGD Interactive's try at a third remake, and newcomers, Infamous Adventures, making their own version. The Infamous Adventures is more of a straight remake of the original, whereas AGDI changed a few plot elements to tie into the more significant changes they made to King's Quest II. Sadly, nobody has ever completed a VGA version of King's Quest IV. I guess sliding repeatedly down a whale tongue in 256 colours doesn't hold that much appeal. This is, after all, a puzzle so frustrating, Sierra gave a take that to themselves at the end of Leisure Suit Larry 3. There's also an Infamous Adventures VGA remake of Space Quest 2, and AGA Interactive have a VGA version of Quest for Glory 2. And that's about it for remasters from the big two of PC adventure gaming, apart from one last oddity. While most of the early 90s Sierra adventures didn't sell well enough to get CD-ROM talkie re-releases, Leisure Suit Larry 6 did, and in doing so, Sierra upscaled all of the graphics to 640x480 SVGA. Since this was a thing, the newest versions of SCI supported. Yes, we had HD remasters, all the way back in 1993. Well, I guess 640x480 Larry is just D. Look, you can't play these games without coming out of the experience a little corrupted. Would we have seen more remastered? Would LucasArts have gone back to Loom and made something more stylistically true to the original in high-res SVGA? Or Sierra reimagine Police Quest 2 in the Mask of Eternity engine? It's somewhat of an academic question, because the graphic adventure famously became the genre which killed itself. Puzzle design became so obtuse and inaccessible that only adventure game diehards could bear to play the things. And in the rush to move to 3D, they lost their unique selling point as the best-looking thing you could buy for your PC. Still, next time you go browsing the Steam listings and find an upgraded and enhanced version of a game you played years ago, remember, it all started with Leisure Suit Larry. And if I don't find myself hunted down for single-handedly destroying the entire Remastered and Definitive Edition industry with that last comment, I'll see you again soon for more PC oddities and obscure technical details.